On April 5th, the same day as the city buried the unidentified out in Brooklyn, the unions led over 100,000 people in a symbolic funeral in Manhattan to honor all of the fire's victims.
People really felt the horror of this event, even if they didn't have people in this fire. I mean, it spoke to the whole city.
People were outraged. They poured into the streets. 100,000 marched in a funeral march that was about mourning, but it was also about protest.
With over 300,000 people looking on, shirtwaist workers, activists, union members, and victims' families silently marched through an icy rain to Washington Place. As they arrived and caught sight of the Ash Building, the eerie quiet suddenly gave way to a heart-piercing cry, which one of the newspapers described as the most impressive expression of human grief ever heard in the city. In the days that followed, grief turned to rage and accusations began to fly as people asked, who was to blame? Was it the building inspectors who allowed inadequate fire escapes? The legislature, which failed to require safety standards? Or the Triangle owners, who ignored recommendations to have fire drills in their crowded factory? As more and more survivor accounts were printed, one appalling narrative came to the forefront. A story was emerging that the young women had been trapped behind a locked door on the 9th floor. There were 2 exit doors on that floor. Each day, the workers were funneled to the Green Street exit so their bags could be checked for stolen material. Had the owners locked the Washington Place exit door to prevent workers from stealing a few scraps of fabric? Finally, on April 11th, Harris and Blank were indicted on charges of manslaughter. They hired Max Stoyer, a Tammany Hall lawyer and a star of the legal profession, to defend them. It took the all-male jury less than 2 hours to return a verdict. Not guilty on all counts. The families were beside themselves, and they waited in the street for the owners to come out.
When the acquittal was announced, Rosie and Katie's brother, David, was outside the courtroom. He screamed at them, you call this justice? You're murderers, murderers.
From a personal point of view, I'm happy that my grandfather didn't have to go to jail. Looking at it from the victims and their families' point of view, if my daughter had died in that fire, and he hadn't been my grandfather, I probably would have shot him.
They had insurance, and they made a lot of money from the insurance from that fire. So despite the fact that 146 people died, that company did not suffer. They went right back into business, and they made money on the fire.
Despite the verdict, the fire had galvanized the movement demanding change from Tammany Hall, the corrupt political machine that ran New York City. They wanted government to show it could represent the rights of all people, not just the privileged.
My name is Alfred E. Smith IV. My great-grandfather was Governor Alfred E. Smith. He was just kind of a typical Tammany guy. They were very, very pro-business. They didn't really look out for the people. They looked out for the people who were giving them money. And if it's not broken, don't fix it. But, he found out, boy, it is broken. The fire brought everybody together. There was such overwhelming sadness and guilt. That scene of those women just wouldn't go away. And Tammany had to change or die.
Al Smith and Robert Wagner set up the Factory Investigating Commission. They brought on board many of the leading reformers of the day. Frances Perkins, who would become the first woman Secretary of Labor, was on the commission. She happened to be in Washington Square Park the day of the fire and witnessed the young women jumping out of the windows. She would go on to say that the New Deal started March 25th, 1911. Also asked to participate were Rose Schneiderman, the legendary labor union activist, and Clara Lemlich, the catalyst of the Shirtwaist Uprising.
The Factory Investigating Commission went out and had investigations all over the state. Al Smith and Robert Weiner themselves actually went into these factories. It was an exhaustive investigation. Al Smith was amazed to see these women and children working 12, 13, 14-hour days. It was really a defining moment for him. He went from being a run-of-the-mill Tammany politician to a leader of reform. The commission went beyond the fire. They looked at the wages, they looked at the hours. The fire was just the beginning of an all-out assault on big business and what they were doing to the workers. The workplace was changed forever.
The commission's findings led to the enactment of laws in New York that mandated safety standards, minimum wage, support for people when they lose their jobs, and assistance when they are too old to work. What started in New York paved the way for FDR's New Deal.
The first duty of our statesmanship is to bring capital and manpower together.
The legislation that came out of the Triangle Fire kind of evened the scales a little bit. It gave working people some support from the government so that they could organize unions, they could fight. That was a huge turning point for labor. Through the unions, they weren't just yids and honkies and wops anymore. They were American workers. They had something. You know, they could be part of this country in a way that they couldn't be before.
The New Deal demonstrated how government could protect working people where business had failed. Each year on the anniversary of the fire, where the building still stands, the union commemorates the 146 victims and the reforms inspired by their deaths.
We're here to remind ourselves that we face the same threats today that these triangle workers faced 100 years ago.
The truth is, most of these factories were like that, because that was what was acceptable behavior. And it isn't, unfortunately, just a few bad apples. Workers need to be protected, whether they're in Bangladesh or Brooklyn, or whether they're in an oil rig, a garment factory, or a coal mine. We had it then and we have it now.
People forget the Triangle Fire at their peril. This whole movement against regulation of industry. And if people want to know what would deregulated industry look like, look at the bodies on the sidewalk outside the Triangle building.
Kate Leon.
Caterina Maltesi, Lucia Maltesi, Rosario Maltesi.
Annie Simonello.
Bettina Mayele.
Celia Gitlin.
Rose Oranger.
Fanny Lansner. Rosie Wiener, 19.
Rebecca Feibisch.
Mary Guya Floresta.
Daisy Lopez Fitzy.
Josephine Carlisi.
Dina Greenberg.
Simi Wasatsky, 17.
May you all rest in peace.